Scales are important in jazz, but you don't need that many scales, and knowing thousands of scales and modes without knowing how to make music with them is completely pointless. So in this video, I'm gonna show you the scales that you need, and I'll also discuss a few that you should definitely not waste time on, plus talk about what scale practice really should be about. This might surprise you, but pentatonic scales don't make the list, and bebop scales are also out, because the question is if they are really scales at all. But I'll explain why later. The major scale is the most important scale to start with. Ask yourself why you're learning scales, and hopefully the answer is that you want a set of notes to use when you're improvising solos. The scales you need come from the songs that you play and the chords in those songs. When it comes to jazz, most jazz songs and pretty much all jazz standards use the major scale, and the basic chord type is a 7th chord, and it will cover most of what you need. That's why it's important. Besides analyzing songs and chords, you can of course also figure this out by looking at solos, but that gets a bit theory heavy quite fast. Just learning the scale is not going to be enough. Solos are not created from just running up and down scales, at least not any good solos. You need to learn the melodies, or what you could consider licks in the scale. For most jazz, this is about learning the arpeggios of the scale, so diatonic triads and 7th chords, and possibly going on to stuff like adding chromatic leading notes, inversions, and chordal arpeggios later on. You want to learn this for all scales, even if it's less obvious in the weird scales later in the video. Keep in mind that I am not telling you to learn the modes. I'll explain that in a bit as well. For guitar, it's incredibly useful to build it up stepwise. So play the scale, learn diatonic thirds, then stack 2 diatonic thirds to create the diatonic triads, and as a final exercise, add a 7th so that you have the 7th chords. And now you have the arpeggios that fit the chords in the songs. In this way, you're easing into learning the 7th chords in the scale and learning the triads along the way. It really connects different chords and triads with the scale and gives you something to work with once you want to solo. Connecting different pieces of information is as important as learning that information when it comes to music. I have a video that explains and demonstrates this for the major scale in much more detail, and actually even goes a bit further. I'll link to that in the video description. Before we continue to the next scale, I want to explain why I'm leaving out the modes. So learning jazz standards is probably the best place to start if you're learning jazz. And standards are tonal pieces of music, they're not modal. So the relationship between the chords and how the harmony flows from one chord to the next is a very important part of the music. And modes are not about that flow. They are about giving you a scale that fits a chord, and then you can use that to improvise over it. But it's not about playing from one chord to the next. Connecting things is important, and modes don't really help you understand how the music flows. It doesn't give you the tools to sum up a few chords in a progression as a building block, or tell you what type of progression a set of chords are. It is also important to remember that you really don't learn a lot by practicing the same scale as C Ionian, D Dorian, E Phrygian, and so on, when you could instead just practice the scale and turn the material into music. Modes can make you waste a lot of time. But this was all about major, and while it's the most common sound, there are chords and songs where you need a different scale. You can get by with 2 more scales for 99% of all the songs, and the 2 scales you need are both minor scales. The first minor scale to work on is the harmonic minor scale. The main reason for learning this is that you want to be able to improvise over a minor 2-5-1. So this progression. And the harmonic minor scale is great for the 5 chord in that progression. Sounds like this. I'm not going to get too much into details with explaining the harmony. If you want to see how the 3 scales cover pretty much all harmony that you'll come across, then I do have a video that explains that. But that's not going to be helpful if you don't already know some songs and are at least familiar with the basic jazz harmony and theory. Harmonic minor is a good example of a scale that you only use for a few specific chords, But since one of them is the dominant chord in the minor key, then you do really want to learn it. What you want to learn and how you want to practice is the same as with the major scale. So start with the scale, then go to the thirds, and then use that to build triads and later seventh chords. Another thing that you want to learn is which triad or seventh chord is on each degree of the scale. In the long run, having a good overview of what chords are in the scales and what notes are in the chords is a powerful tool for developing new solo vocabulary. Another chord type that you use harmonic minor for most of the time is diminished chords, which is often considered quite difficult. I know I threw away the pentatonic and bebop scales at the beginning of the video. I'll explain that, but first let's add the third important scale. After that, the scales become more about special sounds, which is of course also fun. Many lessons will reduce melodic minor to something you use for altered and Lydian dominants, but you really want to start somewhere else. You now have a way to deal with the dominant chord in the minor key using harmonic minor, and you can begin to work on using melodic minor for the tonic minor chords. That is the sound that you hear in the background riff for Autumn Leaves with the G minor 6 arpeggio. With these three scales, you can play most things. So let's first talk about the missing pentatonic scales and then check out some strange sounds. Why do I leave out the pentatonic scales? So the focus until now has been on finding scales that fit with the chords you improvise over. And when it comes to the pentatonic scale, it rarely contains all the notes that are being played in the song under it. In fact, it doesn't actually contain that many different chords. And this is also already true for a basic blues in A, where there are notes in the chords that are not in the scale. For blues, that's a part of the sound, but for jazz, you also want to be able to really connect to the harmony and really spell out the chords. And you only use the pentatonic scale as either a blues sound on top of the song, or as a subset of the scale that you can use to create specific sounding melodies, often something like this. And that means that most of the time, the pentatonic scale is really more of like an arpeggio than a scale. It's something you put on top of the song and not something that really locks in with the harmony of the song. Now that doesn't mean that it isn't useful, but it does mean that it's not directly a part of the harmony. Let's move on to some of those special effects scales. The first scale that you want to add after this is the diminished scale, mainly because it's a fairly common sound for dominant chords with a 13th and a flat 9. The way I played it here, it's starting on A flat and is constructed as whole step, half step, whole step, half step. This just repeats until it's back where it started, and you can think of it as having two variations. One that's starting with a half step and then the other starting with a whole step. But I don't really think about it like that too much. It doesn't have a root, so I just think of it as a set of notes that I'll apply to certain chords. It's sort of a floating sound between altered and unaltered extensions. It is a symmetrical scale, so it's atonal, and you need to do a bit more exploring to figure out what chords are in there, but luckily you can move everything around in minor thirds and use that when you solo. The major triads work really well for this. Here's an example using major triads and inversions over a dominant. I'm only giving you a very superficial overview here. For more information, you can look up other videos. Just ask in the comments if you want some links. The next scale that is a little less common in songs, but that does appear here and there, is the whole tone scale, which is really just starting on a note and then moving up in whole tones until you get back where you started. This is again a symmetrical scale, and now it fits with a dominant with a 9th, a flat 13 and a flat 5. Now you can move everything in whole steps and therefore also in major thirds, because there's of course just 2 whole steps. It sounds something like this. As I mentioned, I'm also leaving out bebop scales because they're not really scales. They are almost more arpeggios with leading notes. And diatonic harmony within that system doesn't really make that much sense. Something that is actually also true for Barry Harris' 6 diminished scale system. Now there are really only 2 chords in these scales, and you kind of end up playing almost modally, something that I'm sure all the Barry Harris fans will love that I say. There is another 6-note symmetrical scale that is a great sound on top of some chords. Usually this is just thrown in on top of a chord that it may only sort of fit, but it is a fun sound to explore, the augmented scale. The scale is constructed by 2 augmented triads a half step apart. Let's take C augmented and B augmented. And if you put these together and then play them from C, you get this scale. Often you'll use the 3 major triads that are found in the scale, so C, E major, and A flat major. And this works really great on sounds like a C major 7 sharp 5, or even put on top of an A minor major 7, which kind of has that C major 7 sharp 5 as an upper structure. That could sound like this. Similar to how you should start with just the major scale and not immediately spend a lot of time on exotic symmetrical stuff that's hard to use, you also want to have a logic build-up when it comes to chords. And there is a really great way to do this, which fits with how Joe Pass thinks about chords. I go over that in this video, even including a few comments from Joe himself. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.